Hi, everybody. This is Bob Ost, and it's Friday, so it's the TRU Community Gathering, as usual. Fridays at 5 o'clock, we meet in this room in Zoom, and the community of artists and producers all get together and have a chance to actually have a voice uh, coming out of what is it, a 17-month pandemic where we were all in shutdown. I started it April 17th, as you probably know the story by now, because we were put into shutdown and everybody was feeling frustrated and confused and isolated. And I thought it would be a good idea just to get together every Friday. At that time, it was 4:30. Now we've moved it up to 5 o'clock, and have a chance to say who you are, what you do, what's happening, and to talk about things that are relevant in some way to the experience that we were all going through. So we've been talking a lot about virtual presentation, and we've asked the question of, if you do a play on virtual medium, is it still theater? We've asked all sorts of interesting questions over the past year. We've talked about podcasts and radio plays and everything else that you can do with virtual medium and isolated performance, what isolated performance is like, isolated virtual performance. The conversation is changing. Um, the good news is that a large percentage of the country is vaccinated, and that there is every indication that we're in a much better place than we were a year ago in terms of the COVID virus. Don't know for sure that we're completely out of the woods yet, but we're stepping into the world, and we're looking at ways of restarting our artistic engines in the live performance world. So today's guests, um, I'm very interested in what they have to say. They're here today because they're going to teach me about things that I don't know that much about. We're going to talk today about performance art, devised performance, and things that are part of the live performance world that don't necessarily start with a play, a narrative linear play. So we're going to meet now Pablo Helguera and Sarah Hughes. Pablo, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do? I know that you already said to me earlier that I'm in a strange world because I'm not a theater person. So
I, I know.
being
Well,
being being a non-theater person, Pablo, tell us how it is that you happen to instigate theatrical performances.
in 20 seconds.
You could take no. We're past the 20-second limit now. We're
Um,
now in like talk, fill the hour. Okay.
okay, okay. So, hello everyone again. It's great to be here. I'm Pablo Helguera, and I'm originally from Mexico City, and I identify myself as a visual artist, but also as a performance artist. And I was born and raised in Mexico City. I come from a family of musicians, classical musicians. So the performing arts were always part of my life. And but because I had the ability to draw, and my parents decided that being an artist was my future, a visual artist, and I ended up. And they kind of said like, "Well, you'll be an artist." And I'll be okay. I'll be an artist, I guess.
Can I just tell you something? For an American audience to hear that a family encouraged you to be an artist is like a really
I know
okay.
it's very
My
funny.
mom always said, find something else in case you can't make a living at it.
The funny thing was that my dad wanted to be an artist, but my grandfather did not want him to, and he wanted him to be a
That's the
businessman.
story I know.
So he will be like, no, 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 you're not gonna, you're gonna do art because that doesn't make any money. So you're gonna have to be. So he actually wanted me to do the thing that he did not have a chance to do, which I am very grateful for, of course. And anyway, but
There's a great Thanksgiving story right now. Thanksgiving, give thanks for a family that actually supported you in your art.
yes,
We don't hear about that a whole lot.
but I mean, briefly, I'll tell you then what happened with my encounter with theater and performance. So I went to school at the Institute of Chicago. I went to study there, and to be a painter. And I was trying to paint, but I wanted to tell stories through paint, and that was very hard to do, because painting is not, I mean, of course you can tell stories through paint, but I wanted to tell narrative stories. I wanted to like do something beyond the canvas. And then one day I took a class of performance art in school, which I thought was ridiculous. I thought it was like embarrassing. I thought that everybody just got naked and did like dumb things. And I was like, I'm not gonna do that.
You
But
pour
then,
fluids over yourself of some sort.
yes, and this was like the late 80s. So we were very fluid oriented at the time, you know, bodily fluids. But anyway, so I nonetheless fell in love with the idea that anything could be a performance. You know, that I could include music, I could include my paintings, I could include images, I could sing, and many other things. And when I graduated, it was really hard to get a show because it was the early 90s, the country was under a recession, and it was really hard to show your art. However, in Chicago, if some of you are connected or know Chicago, it's an amazing city full of theaters, a very strong theater scene. And there was a little community theater called the Blue Rider Theater that was in the area of Pilsen, which is in the west side of Chicago. Um, and a friend of mine who was also a student, he had organized a little festival and invited me to do a performance. And I went, I did it, and I thought it was an amazing experience. I don't think the performance was very good, but I loved being in the theater. And that led to them inviting me to write a play. And then my first play, I wrote it there for that little theater. And there was something really magical about that experience. Like for me, I remember vividly being on backstage on the opening night and seeing all these characters behind the curtain, and then thinking, oh my God, I have created these people, like these individuals that are standing behind the curtain. These are actual characters that I created. There was something really, I guess, maybe very basic for anybody in the world of theater, but for me, that was really special. And ever since that time, I've always done work that straddles between what you will call performance art and what is more perhaps theatrical.
So we're going to come back to that. We're going to explore that a little bit more. And I'm gonna turn to Sarah now. Sarah, you have a very amazing background. I mean,
Oh,
this was not exactly, you didn't like jump into performance art and devised theater. You actually had a whole journey. Can you tell us a little bit about your? I mean, I'm particularly interested in the elevator.
elevator repair service.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I can't think of the name of it, but I mean, I love the work that they've done.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your background. You didn't start off. Did you say at some point early on, oh, I want to help create devised theater, or
Um, yeah, great question. Sorry, I just realized I need to hide my self view because I can't look at myself talking. um,
okay,
um, hi, first of all, thanks so much for having me. And it was so nice to hear stories and backgrounds. It's really cool. And to read about everyone's projects in the chat. It's inspiring. Yeah, I did not like come out of the womb thinking, you know what I want to do? Experimental theater. I would say, yeah, in college, I had one professor. I went to a school that has a like pretty conservative theater program. It's definitely not, it's not a conservatory. It just sort of, I studied it in undergrad, but it's a lot of musicals, a lot of, straightforward plays. But I had one professor who was like, you should know about Richard Foreman, and you should know about the Worcester Group, and you should know about these companies that are doing things that are maybe a little bit different. That was just kind of what she was interested in. And so I kind of latched onto that and got excited about these sort of alternate forms of making things. I hadn't heard of devising, like I didn't know that was really a thing, but the idea of taking material that wasn't authored by a single person and turning it into something else was very appealing to me. Site-specific work was really appealing to me. All these things that I hadn't really been familiar with. And then I had the opportunity to meet Elevator Repair Service. They came up to my college right after I graduated. So I was up there And I did an internship sort of helping to run this residency that New York Theater Workshop had at my school. And so I was, in charge of like helping people find their parking passes and like printing scripts and, all kinds of fun stuff. But I really knew my way around because I had been there for 4 years, and ERS was up there working on The Sound and the Fury, which they were going to premiere at New York Theater Workshop the following spring. And we just kind of got along really well. I got really interested in their work kind of as an offshoot of, or as a sort of inheritor of some of the Worcester Group's aesthetic. And, it sort of picked up on some of the things that I was interested in that I didn't really know how to get started with that kind of work.
So actually, could you tell us a little bit what you would consider the Worcester Group's aesthetic?
Sure. Or I guess approach really at that time. Like, I don't know if I had a strong sense of their aesthetic when I was, 20. I think it was more just like the approach of taking a text that maybe we think we know really well, like Hamlet, and taking it apart. That show was in New York kind of just as I was graduating from school. And I saw that and was kind of blown away that you could make a Hamlet kind of just by looking at the Richard Burton Hamlet, but that maybe there could be things in that that told you different things about the Shakespeare play that you weren't aware of. And then also taking things that are not plays, and that could be the source material for a piece of performance. That was just a very new idea to me.
Was GAT before you?
So GATS, yeah. So I met ERS. They had already created GATS and they had toured it in.
GAT was a Great Gatsby.
Yeah. So just for folks who don't know, GATS is the show that ERS is probably the most famous for. It's an 8-hour production of The Great Gatsby. So it's a full reading of the book. The book is on stage the whole time, and the entire text of the book is read, but it kind of takes over the world of the stage and the world of the play, and the book kind of comes to life via all these characters, but you do hear every single word of the book. So it's this marathon production, and it's very wild. You sort of leave. You sit there for 8 hours, which sounds so long, and you also kind of don't want it to be over. So that they had created already and had toured in Europe when I met them. So I was lucky enough to meet them in 2007 and begin working with them almost immediately, again, because I was sort of up at my school seeming like I was really good at stuff because I knew my way around and they didn't. So they were like, wow, she seems smart. And I was like, it's actually just that I know where the copier is. I'm actually, 21 and I have no idea what I'm doing. But I started working with them and helped to develop The Sound and the Fury, which was part of this trilogy of pieces based on modernist novels. So it's The Great Gatsby, The Sound and the Fury, and The Sun Also Rises. And then I was able to go on tour with them, touring all around Europe and the States with all 3 of those shows, and then continuing to develop further pieces with them, Arguendo, which is their piece based on Supreme Court oral arguments, and Fondly Colette Richland, which is one of the only pieces they've done where there was a playwright in the room. Sybil Kempson was part of she wrote the play, but she sort of wrote it with and for the company. So it was a very devised process. A lot of how it kind of came out on the page was due to things that were happening in the room. So that's how I kind of got into thinking about theater from kind of almost any place other than here is a play that has been published. The person who wrote it may or may not be alive. And you have to do what's you have to do what's in the script, and you kind of have to follow the stage directions. So that's the kind of work I do the least of.
Well, and just to make a note of it, that form of theater has made it to Broadway, thanks to Jane Dubin and her cohorts. So we have transcribed theater. We have Is This a Room and Dana H. Both are based on transcriptions. So these are things that were not conceived of as plays, but that you take text and you find a way to theatricalize it, to dramatize it.
Yeah. And I was very lucky to get to work with Half Straddle also in a producerial role in a couple shows, but not, I didn't work on Is This a Room, but love those folks and just could not be happier to see those 2 pieces on Broadway. Really highly recommend people see them if they can.
There aren't a
I haven't
lot
seen
of,
them on Broadway, but
we haven't done a lot on Broadway in that, but I know that there have been other examples of it. It's not completely new.
yeah.
But I guess the question for me as a writer is there a place for a writer in devised theater? Is there a place for a playwright? And how does that work? And
Yeah.
Pablo, I don't know if you've ever considered that. You're a playwright yourself, but you live in that world between the written word and the devised performance. So you could also throw some light on that for us.
Well, Sarah, why don't you answer, and then I'll talk about from the visual arts perspective.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think as I was saying about Sybil Kempson, that was an instance of Sybil is, has been writing her own work for a long time, often performs in her own work, also frequently directs her own work. Like she's a little bit of a one-man band in that way, one human band. She was, a longtime friend of Elevator Repair Service, had been in a couple of the shows. She was actually in GATS on tour. She took over for Susie Sokol in the role of Jordan Baker, and did a really great job. And so I think she and John, the director of Elevator Repair Service, got interested in working together. And John likes to have something to push off of. I think that's true. I think there certainly are devising companies who say, okay, we're going to start rehearsal and everyone's just going to bring in stuff they're interested in, and we're going to build something from that, or we're going to go around and interview everyone in the room, and that's going to be kind of the starting point. I think John likes to have a thing. And so Sybil sort of started creating that thing. And then it was a little bit of a give and take, where she would come in with pages, we would work on them, the actors would run with it a little bit and improvise or mess around, or John would push her in some direction, and then she would go away and write down some stuff that had happened in rehearsal and kind of bring that back in. So it kind of became it was kind of going back and forth through the meat grinder, if that makes sense.
It was the point for many in the room is that there is a place for a playwright. It may not be exactly a playwright, but it's a writer in this medium. You basically you can start with the idea. I mean, it can grow from just an idea and just a concept, and it can also grow from a piece of art. Pablo, isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I often think about is more the form of writing or of creating that is more of like American modernism, like John Cage or Merce Cunningham, where you will take a structure of something and then create a composition out of that, but use strategies like borrowing text from different sources, or whatever sounds that are around, you start incorporating them. So it's kind of creating a score of something they're going to do, and then the content becomes filled through the score. So that's just one strategy. So I think I find it exciting when there's a moment where there's no clear roles, like the playwright is no longer the playwright and the director is no longer the director, or the actor is no longer exactly an actor, but when the boundaries get a little blurred, it becomes really interesting. As opposed to being really strict about what everybody needs to be doing. So I just find that kind of interesting.
Well, isn't the most commercial example of that a chorus line? That was kind of devised. They sat around the room. They all contributed their stories. It was around a central idea of. It became. I mean, it's so commercial that I don't think anybody thinks of it as devised theater. Except for the actors who helped write it.
Yeah, that's a cool example. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if I understand the process correctly, that the other thing that you said earlier, Pablo, that surprised me was you talked about the appeal of narrative in your work, and how does one structure narrative in devised theater, and is it linear?
Well, I think
can it be linear, or and it doesn't have to be linear? I mean, how does it work really?
I guess it depends how you define narrative, right? I mean, I was initially speaking about something really basic, which is like telling stories, right?
Yeah.
And then that's why, one of my teachers once, when I was in art school, told me like, well, you're not going to be a painter. And I was like, what? You don't know, because you like to tell stories, because you like to tell things that evolve over time. So you cannot do this in painting in the same way. So you're going to be either a performer or a filmmaker. And he was completely right. I mean, I was 19 when he told me that, and it's incredible that he actually got it. So anyway, for me, narrative is not necessarily just telling a story from A to Z, or like at the beginning and the end, but it's kind of like using language to start a thread that it evolves in many ways. It can be nonlinear. It can be like segmented. It can have. I mean, I'm interested in multiple narratives with one another, like one voice, like a fugue, like the music, like the musical format of the fugue, like story number one, story number two, and number three, and then they start intertwining. So I mean, I like the possibilities of something like emerging and then functioning as counterpoint with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this. In I'm sure there are many forms of this sort of work. In general, is there a guiding force, or is everybody an equal partner in devised theater? I mean, and I think philosophically everybody's a partner, but is the director the guide on this? Who guides it all?
I mean, I think that really depends on the company. I think there are some companies that consider themselves to be very democratic, where maybe they even go as far as having people vote on the ideas. Like I haven't been a part of that particular process. I know the team that Rachel Chavkin started, all of the performers were contributing text. They all sort of considered themselves writers. She was the director of the company. But I think they tried really hard, and I think they continue to try to sort of like be a little bit anti-hierarchy in that way. ERS is not like that. Like John would be the first one to say, like he's not going to come up with the ideas, but he's where the buck stops. And that's, I think, everyone who sort of signs on to be a part of that process or is a part of that company is like, yeah, great. Like John will eventually make a decision, and that's kind of what we'll do. And it'll be based on a shared understanding that we've built together and a bunch of stuff that we've all brought in and a bunch of things that we've created. But like John is the director and sort of the outside eye that's shaping it. I think there are a lot of different ways to work it. And I think it really depends on the personalities of the people and how the company sort of decides what their values are. Personally, in the work that I did with the RS and the work that I do myself, I do find that there does have to be not necessarily just one person, but like a general force of outsideness and shaping and like singular decision making that happens that comes in at some point for me in order to feel satisfied by the work. And I think that's sort of personal to me. I try really hard to create an environment where people feel like they have a container, they have some boundaries, but within that they can contribute a lot of things. They're sort of safe to try crazy stuff, and but that eventually, I try not to give the impression that it's just going to kind of be everyone votes on the thing and that's how we decide, because that would be disingenuous.
Right.
So I think it's possible to have a very like an extremely collaborative, extremely like, really listening to people, hearing everyone's voices, and still have sort of a final decision maker.
A company that I admire very much that does this kind of work, and again, I'm not a theater person, but there's a company called Force Entertainment that is based in Sheffield in the UK, run by Tim Etchells, who's an amazing artist, playwright. I mean, this is what they do. They come together and they start improvising. They start developing a project, and I think what those examples show to me is that in order for these projects to be successful, you really need to know one another very well and understand each other's strengths and the places where everybody else needs support. And it becomes like a project of chemistry, of collective chemistry, that it gets better as the more you do it. but I think it's something that's risky to do when you don't know anybody, or previously, as you come and then you start this project. It may or may not work. It's kind of like dating, you know, like there might not be any chemistry, or people might have completely different ways of doing things. So it's exciting, but it also can be very challenging.
There are a lot of blurred lines in this. I mean, I don't know whether, as hard as we might try to clearly define this, it seems like there are just areas of crossover. My biggest overview of everything is I'm trying to find out the essential difference between a play, directing a play and putting on a play, and the process that's involved in creating a piece of performance art or a piece of devised theater. So devised theater or performance art will start with an idea that sort of is embellished and is developed in a collaborative process. Ideas are exchanged and it becomes an entity of some sort. But it's not it doesn't start with a script. I mean, I can be that simple about it, right? Can't I? Does it ever start with a script?
Well, I mean, no, because performance art is not theater. At least the way I understand it is because it's something that is drawn from ideas more than a specific script, and it also is something that is very linked to real life. Like when I am performing in a performance artwork, I am not a character. I am Pablo. You know, I am not creating a fourth wall. You know, I'm actually still in this place doing something myself. So it becomes very different. And while it's informed by ideas and an aesthetic and something else, but there's no like particular script. So it's hard to make those comparisons, I guess.
Does there ever become a script, or is the whole idea that it's something that becomes it's improvisational and therefore it's different every time it's performed?
Well, let's see. Like for example, there's just to give you an example. There's Fluxus, which is like this movement in the 1960s. There were actually students of John Cage that actually went to school at the new school where I teach today. These were artists that started becoming interested in doing performative works, and they decided to make instruction art, which were very simple things. Like Yoko Ono was part of Fluxus, and many other amazing artists. And they would do crazy things like destroying a piano, you know, or walking on stage with a tuba full of ping pong balls, and then like they would just move, and the ping pong balls would follow the tuba. I mean, they were really like ridiculous, kind of clownish acts that were really funny.
But at the heart of them, weren't they trying to expound on and sort of draw a line under certain elements of experience? Like John Cage is famous for using silence, but the point was for us to understand that silence is a part of our experience.
Yeah, so there's a score. So the 433 has a score, which you can say it's a script, but it's basically a score that says the musician sits at the piano and it's going to sit there for
4 minutes and 33 seconds.
And that's what the script says.
Yeah.
You perform it whichever way you want it, but that's what it says. So I think some people call it a score, some people call it a script, some people call it whatever it is, composition. But I mean, it is like a more or less open-ended kind of like guidelines for what you're supposed to do, like I don't know, like a recipe, I guess.
Yeah, a set of instructions or something.
Yeah. And I think Elevator Repair Service has done some of that, I imagine.
Definitely. I mean, and I think like, again, it's a question like with a devised piece, there often is, there's nothing that could be considered the performance text until the company has built it. And then there is a performance text. Like I was the stage manager. I would run the shows. Obviously I had a script. The script would go to the, people who were running the lighting board op or the soundboard op, or the house manager at the theater, so that they knew what was happening in the show and when they could open the doors and let in late seating. Like there was a script, but the script had been generated by by the company over the course of a lot of time of working together. And maybe the jumping off point for it was, you know, The Great Gatsby or something like that. I mean, I work a lot with an artist who you know, it considers himself a playwright in essays, and he'll hand me a thing that basically is an essay. And then our job together with the actors is to sort of figure out how you might split that essay up into roles for different performers. And then it becomes a script where there are stage directions built in and there are sort of role assignments, text assignments, but that doesn't happen until we've done it together. So there's sort of two different objects. There's the thing he wrote at the beginning, which is essentially an essay, and then there's the performance text, and that's created over time. So that would be my answer. I also just want to say I may turn off my camera. I have an 8-month-old baby who I need to nurse. So I will still be here and present, but you may hear small baby sounds and I will be nursing him. So I will have my camera off for a moment.
Okay.
That's the Devised theater piece that Sarah's going to perform.
Yeah,
exactly.
Involving my baby.
What I wanted, I mean, can I ask you a question while you're nursing?
Of course, please. No,
Okay.
no, absolutely.
So basically, I'm trying to clarify this because a lot of us are really new to all of these ideas that you're talking about, and I want to first of all stress that performance art and devised theater are two different things. I understand that performance art. Do you do both, Pablo, or would you consider yourself mostly performance art?
I really would define myself as a performance artist. So,
Okay.
I mean, I do think there's a big difference between. I think devised theater has to be a collaborative project, but performance art tends to be very individual oriented. Even if you involve others, I think it's usually driven by one person, the artist.
So haven't you and Sarah worked together? Why did?
Yes.
I was under the impression that you had.
Yes, we just worked on a play that just finished running a few weeks ago.
So what was that? Tell us about that.
Well, okay. Where should I start? So I met Sarah around 2012. Sarah, was it 2012, 2013?
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sarah was working with an organization called OCR, Office of Creative Research. It's a collective that she was managing, and I was working at MoMA, and we were doing a project with them, and that's how I met Sarah. I learned that she did directing, and I was involved in creating a performance for the Guggenheim. Was it the Guggenheim, Sarah, first, or?
The first piece was the Guggenheim, and the second one was BAM.
Yeah. So I was working on a performance for the Guggenheim Museum, and it has theatrical elements. It had theatrical elements to it. So I asked Sarah whether she would like to become involved in directing us, or co-directing, since I had been creating the piece and I was in it. So that was how we started working together, and it was an amazing.
I have a question for you. Had you worked with the director before, or had you always been on your own?
I had worked with a director before, like that example I gave about the Blue Rider Theater. I was directed, I wrote the play and I was performing in it, and I was directed by someone, which was a great experience to me. And I loved the possibility of writing a play and performing in it and not being the director. And so I had experienced that over the years a number of times. So there was, because I feel that it's necessary for me to also not play that role. It's just very hard to be in a piece and then directing it, right?
Right.
But anyway.
Well, there's a very large parallel in the theater world, which is solo performance, and we have tons of solo performance. It's an entire genre that has hundreds and hundreds of people that are engaged in it, and it's always interesting to see how a solo performer adjusts from being their own director to actually working with the director. In general, I think the outside eye is awfully important in shaping something. I think that you seeing yourself on stage is different from how a director actually sees you when you're actually up there and moving and doing it. So I mean, I see that as kind of a parallel for that some people in the room can relate to. Um, I, Sarah, I wanted to ask you, from a director's point of view, can you identify some of the differences between how you work with an existing script and how you worked in devised performance? I mean, some of this may be going over a lot of the similar ground that we've talked to, but I'm trying to put it into contexts that are familiar contexts for the rest for many of us in the room, so that we can see how we would adjust and adapt if we were to move into your area.
Hmm. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, I can use actually Pablo's work and our work together a little bit as an example. I think, just to sort of segue from that, the project we did at the Guggenheim and the project we did at BAM, I guess more the project we did at BAM, that to me, Pablo, I guess of all three feels the most like performance art in a way, because um, we were like, everyone was sort of secretly intervening with the audience. The audience had a certain impression of who the performers were, and then they were actually doing sort of a different thing than that. They had part of the performer's job was that they had more information about the audience than the audience assumed that an actor might. So that was a really interesting project to work on, because I feel like also my job was about sort of just figuring out how the whole thing was going to work. Hold on one second.
Got it.
We should perhaps explain what this project was, because it's
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that might be good.
complicated. So it was called the Parable Conference. It was at BAM, and I was told, or I was invited to do the piece a year out, and I thought it would be interesting to start a relationship with the audience a year out before the performance, and then I had this idea of sending letters to individual people over the course of a whole year, each letter with different stories, and then we'll send different stories to different people, inviting them. There's going to be a performance a year from now in this theater, so I want you to be there. But in preparation for that, I'm going to be sending you stories. They were parables about art. So every week or so, people would get letters from me telling a different story, and I kept track of who was getting what kind of stories. Everybody was getting very different material. I mean, I corresponded with 200 or 400 people over the course of a year.
Wow.
Sending those stories. It was insane. And then toward the end, or on the day of the performance, we had a whole cast. There were, I don't remember how many performers, Sarah's 8 or 9. And
That's right.
we turned the theater into kind of like a gala space. So there were no seats per se. There were like tables, as if you were attending a wedding. People were invited to dress in formal attire, in black on white or white.
So,
and then,
so this is another blurred line. This is the line. This is the line that goes into immersive theater or environmental theater, which is a whole other aesthetic. But no, go on. I'm just stating the obvious.
So you would arrive with the letters that you received throughout the year from me. You will be given a number, like when you go to a wedding or like a benefit or something, and then you sit at a table, a round table, and then there were all these actors that were also formally dressed, in formal attire, and they will all be named Pablo, men and women, and they would address you by your first name, and they knew everything about you. They knew all the letters you had received. They had researched your biography. They will be like, "Hi, Bob, how's your show going?" And they will know a lot of things that were really very, in a way, kind of indiscreet. They had researched you and Googled you and knew a lot of things about you. And you, of course, know nothing about these people who are only named Pablo. And then they narrate some of the stories that I tell in those letters. But it was kind of like a gathering of everybody kind of comparing notes about all the stories they had received, and then kind of like making sense of what all these stories mean. But the important thing that I think Sarah was referring to is this was a very collaborative process where the actors were very involved in in delivering those stories, and also learning about the specific guests they had to talk to. So there was a lot of elements where there was not just kind of like a straight directing, kind of like you have to do this, but it was really like a dialogue, a collaboration.
Right. So yeah, I would say like that as a good example of like a piece of performance art that functioned kind of like a piece of devised theater, in that we kind of had to figure it all out together, how it was going to work, and kind of collaborate to, you know, the performers' contributions were very important on sort of how it was all going to come together, versus, you know, the piece we just did, which was a lot more like a typical play. You know, you wrote a script, you sent it to me, you sent it to the actors, you had assigned the text ahead of time, and then like over the course of working on it, there were some changes to, you know, how the text was going to be divided, based on sort of how things went in the room. So there were like changes to the script in a way, but it wasn't, you know, essentially it was a fixed piece of script that then we performed.
Yeah, so now I should describe this latest piece. It's called A Journal of the Year of the Pharmacy. And it's based on my diaries over the last 2 years during COVID, basically, you know? And I think like many of us during these last 2 years of confinement and horribleness of many different things, like many of us kind of like had a very like a moment of introversion, introspection, you know? And I wrote a lot about my own life, my own childhood, and also about the job that I was struggling with my museum job that I eventually left. So a lot of these stories were in the diaries, and so the piece is basically the diaries. And what I decided that we should do is that it should not be just like a very long monologue with me, but we will have other two actors also reading or not performing those sections of the diary. So it's kind of like, again, many 2-3 versions of me talking to the public about the last 2 years or so. I don't know, Sarah, how would you describe it?
Okay, well, let's. I just want to come back to an overview a little bit. So basically, the broad topic that I think that we're talking about is just non-traditional forms of theater. I don't know. We can quibble about what the actual wordings should be, but we've talked about devised theater. We've talked about performance art. We've mentioned the is this a room based on text theater that's based on existing texts and that basically tries to translate the text into a theatrical form, and certainly immersive theater is another aspect of all of this as well. I guess I'm going to go to the room right now because I've seen there's been lots of questions and lots of comments while we've been doing this. Ralph Lewis mentions whether Jean-Claude Van Italy was one of the first playwrights of devised theater. I don't think of him as that because I think his plays all started with his texts. I'm not sure whether they came out of a group conversation or not. Do you know, Sarah?
Don't. I should be more familiar with that process and his work, and I'm not, unfortunately.
Yeah, there may have been some improvisation involved, but I think he taught playwriting, so I mean he viewed himself as a playwright. In fact,
yeah. I guess I would just say to that point that like the term devised is pretty new, and that actually like I would say that there was a lot of work that we maybe think of, and maybe A Chorus Line is a great example, that we sort of think as like classic and indelible as part of the American canon, that, you know, didn't start in the straight ahead way of someone sitting down and writing a script and then trying to sort of pitch it and sell it, and that the terminology for that is actually the newer thing than the process. I don't know.
One of the producers of the Remarque Green asks, how does the company participate in revenue if they help create a performance piece? Do they participate in residuals, for instance? Sarah, I think you're frozen.
I saw that question. I love, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear
No,
me?
you're back. You're back. You're back.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that question. I love that question. There's another question here about like, what's the economics of companies that work like this? And I love that people are asking these questions because I think we don't talk about them enough. I can speak to, ERS, the actors were all paid like a weekly rate, which was actually much better than the equity weekly rate. And then when GATS did very well, which is the one show that ERS has, I would say just like really, they're a nonprofit. That's the one show that has really kind of like paid for itself and then some, and kind of put them in a position where they felt like they had extra money, which is obviously extremely rare for a nonprofit.
Extra money in theater. Okay.
Yeah,
Let me think about that for a second. Okay.
It was like, whatever the budget was at the beginning of the year, I think it was like it blew it out of the water
Right.
because it did so well in New York, and they it extended, and it was doing so well on tour that in the case of that show, they went to everyone who had ever been involved in the show and paid them like a bonus, because so many of those people had developed it for, a beer, had done rehearsals and rehearsals and rehearsals in the 90s because they had started working on that show in the 90s and then put it on the back burner for a long time.
What? No pizza?
Yeah, maybe pizza, but like really no money. And so folks like Scott Shepard, who's the lead in that show, they were like, you get a bonus. It's to pay you for all those weeks back when we were working in a loft on Avenue A, making that show. So that, I know they took that very seriously. I haven't been with the company since 2014, 2015. So I'm not sure if they've changed their model since then. I think what they try to do is compensate their actors really well for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsal that are oftentimes seem like they're not going anywhere. And that's one of the craziest things about working in that way. And so you can spend a month reading through a bunch of stuff, and at the end of it, you don't even have, there's nothing really there. You're like, what did we even do? And then 1 week later, you're like, oh, here, this is the piece. Like we found a shape for the thing and we're going to move forward. So I think
there's something that's a great takeaway. Found the shape. So the whole process is about finding the shape for the piece. That I can relate to, that I can understand.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And finding that together and then kind of being like, now we're going to go forward from there. But it's not, I guess the one thing I will say is that the format for most devised companies, it is not the like 3.5 week rehearsal process where, if you're doing an off-Broadway show, you sort of expect folks have come in, they're mostly off book. The director says some stuff at the beginning about where you think it's going to go, but mostly like you have 3.5 weeks. Like you can't spend that much time figuring out what the thing is. You kind of have to know going in. And with devised things, it's like, GATS, it took them like 10 years. The Sound and the Fury was like a 4-year process. All those shows just took
there is a workshop. There's a workshop process in commercial theater that could accommodate this to some degree.
Of course.
But it's
of course, and I think it's not.
It's much more expensive.
But yes, it's much more expensive. And I would say it's also like, it's not always the same people, right? You might do a workshop with one group of actors and then you bring 2 of them forward into the next one, but so-and-so has a TV gig and it's not going to work. So I think the thing with the RS is it's like, whatever the people who have been working on it, that tends to be, they sort of continue and continue.
I see another comment from Ralph where he wants to know whether Strider on Broadway was a devised piece. Again, that's not how I know Strider. I know Strider is story theater, and story theater is a whole other aspect of storytelling in theater. And I know that I believe the director was Robert Kalfin. I will ask Robert because he's a friend of mine, but I don't think it would have been a devised piece. It may have been. There may have been. If you're thinking in terms of improvisational elements in the development of new works, that's another conversation, and that happens all the time in any sort of to some degree any play that you're putting up on its feet. There could be elements of improvisation, things that are brought to it that the writer may not have thought of, that the actor brings in, and that the director brings in as well. But it's not as inherent to the process as it is in devised theater, where it's all about that. It's all about the improvisation and the collaboration and the multiple ideas that come together and are eventually find their shape. Is that fair? Have I said anything that's really stupid?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I also am just seeing, just to sort of jump on this.
That's my Rachel Maddow coming out.
I see Eric asked this question about how do unions feel about such long development. I'll just go ahead and say they hate it.
Of course they do.
That was
Yeah.
like so many arguments with equity. They really were like, how can this be? How can you be working in this way? And it was, it continues to be a little bit of an issue.
It's an area of theater that should have its
work.
own agreements. Really, it's so unlike how you work. In the it's not the expectation that any of these contracts would come with. That would be something somebody should really kind of talk to equity about. It seems like there should be a separate kind of agreement for that kind of theater. Also, because it's not as, I mean, forgive me for saying, it's not as commercial. So you're not, you can't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in devising this and then play to audiences, to scrappy off-Broadway audiences who can afford to go to this kind of theater and may not be able to afford to go to a Broadway show.
Right.
That's a whole issue. Let me see what else is in here that we should look at. Candy shared something about the International Museum Theater Alliance. Let's see, Eric Rothman. Paul Smith, wonder what our guests think of the process Elena Critter used at Ground Rush Farm to devise and collaboratively create with movement and language Night Witches. Are you familiar with it? Well,
I'm not. I saw people mentioning Double Edge Theater, which I am familiar with, but I haven't heard of Ground Rush.
So Double Edge Theater, they do devised theater. Is that correct?
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
In Night
yeah,
Witches,
it's very company created.
in Night Witches, the actresses actually try to duplicate the movement of planes as if there were pilots dive bombing. They'd heard of tales of Russian women dive bombers in World War II who scared the Germans. They didn't know what was going on. And it was all women bombers. So the actors were part of this, and the sort of director, they spent weeks on a farm to figure out how to turn this into a play.
Oh,
Yeah.
I got back to Ralph Lewis, by the way. Ralph Lewis says that Jean-Claude Valladolid wrote the plays that were done by Joseph Chaikin. So perhaps there is an element of that in that. So he may be right, but I'm more aware of America Hurrah and some of the pieces that I know that he wrote for performance. Let's see. Actually, guys, do a virtual hand raise, and maybe you can ask the question, and then we can hear somebody else's voice besides ours and Paul's, who joined us just now. Anyone have any other questions? Any comments? Any confusions that you want cleared up? Yeah, well, we already know what unions feel about this. Okay. So what always happens is there's always this moment after I ask people to raise their hand and ask a question where I start to end the conversation, and then the hands go up. So let's see what happens. As it happens tonight, for the first time in 86 weeks, I actually have tickets for the Philharmonic. So I will be, by the way, opening up breakout rooms, just so you know, Pablo and Sarah, so that everybody can meet each other. And if you can stay and meet people in the breakout rooms, I know they would love it. But if you can't, that's okay too. You're not required to stay. You've done your duty already.
I unfortunately can't stay, but I will give you my email, and would love to stay in touch with whoever. I'll put it in the chat if whoever wants to reach out or be in touch. I also write
Yeah.
I also write a weekly column that it's about art, but there's some things aspects about performance, so I'll put it in the chat as well.
Okay. And who's asking for host privileges? Connor, I gave you host privileges already. Oh, maybe I'm supposed to give him. So Connor is my assistant is going to take over so that he can run the breakout rooms for me while I go. So you don't have host privileges. So let me see. I thought I did that already. I'm going to make you the host. Let's see. How's that go? You got it? Do you have any questions about performance art and devised theater?
I am actually really curious from a writing perspective, how just like what the rehearsal room looks like, and like how set the roles are of like writer director, because I feel like in a normal workshopping space, it's very not rigid, but it is more well defined. So I am very curious of how like if there is a kind of any kind of hierarchy, or if there is any kind of if it's more of a co-op situation, that interests me.
To me, it seems to me that logically speaking, that it's important that it probably changes from company to company, but they have to set the rules and they have to be clear from the beginning. I think somebody has to set the rules at the beginning. How do you run your rehearsals, Sarah?
I would say it is very different company to company. I would say of all the companies I'm sort of thinking of right now, there does tend to be a director who's sort of pulling people together, has an eye to the larger production and the production values, maybe is going to bring in designers, and be thinking about that kind of big picture stuff. I would say there isn't always a writer. There sometimes it really is like we are generating text from, there's so many different ways to sort of talk about devising. I think some companies that would consider themselves a devising company work from interviews. I'm thinking actually of Houses on the Moon, the company that Jane's on the board of. They do a lot of work where they have conversations with people in communities, and then they're sort of using some of those conversations in that text to create a piece. And so in that case, like, is there a writer? Maybe there's a shaper, maybe there's a dramaturg, or maybe the whole company kind of takes on that role. I tend to kind of bring a devising process to whatever I work on. So even when I am working on a new play, it's typically with a playwright who is kind of excited about seeing what the actors and what I'm going to bring to the play, and is like willing and interested in that shifting the text as we move forward. So I would say I was just trying to create an environment where, again, like everyone feels safe, that there's like a container, that there's a shape, there's like, we kind of know where we're going. There's an end point, but we don't really know how we're going to get there. We don't really know what it's going to look like when we do, and that all of their contributions are going to be kind of brought into that, and that I think, this was actually just to get back to that question of like kind of credit and royalties. I try to be really upfront that like, if we think there's going to be something that the actors say or do that's going to end up in a written script that has someone else's name on it as like a writer, that like we have to have a conversation about that, because I personally think it's like unethical for like someone to go out in the world and be like, this is the play I wrote, and like half of what's in it is like stuff that actors said in the room, or stage directions that are based on blocking that like me and someone else came up with, and so I think that's very important to me to sort of say like, maybe we say that this text was created by the company, and that everyone counts as an author of that. So that's just as like an ethics, I would say that's important to me.
And I have one last question before we say goodbye to the YouTube viewers. Pablo and Sarah, what would you tell people in the room who've never been involved in, or who are used to being involved in scripted plays? What can you tell them that would explain to them why they might find it a great experience to do devised theater or performance art? What would they get out of it that they might not get out of what they're doing already? How would you recruit someone?
One thing I didn't mention is that I'm also an educator, and I've done arts education for my whole career as well. And one thing that I find really interesting is like as adults, we get really kind of self-conscious about our bodies, about our behavior. So we want structures, we want to be told what to do, so a script seems like a natural thing. But if you look at kids, kids are completely free and completely spontaneous, and they will just like try the craziest things, because for them everything is a game, everything is like enjoyment, and I feel that working this way brings you back to those moments where you can be spontaneous, where you can discover incredible things about yourself and your own creativity when you let yourself explore without a structure that has been pre-established. So I think there's something very liberating about this process, and where you can find things that you will have never found before if you let yourself explore that way.
That's great. Thank you. And Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. I guess I would like add on to that and say, I just worked with students in it was on a new play, but it was a play that was in process. The playwright was adding new pages and changing the play as we were working. It was with undergrads at Purchase College. And at the end of it, we had a postmortem, and one of the actors said, I didn't know before this process that it was possible to feel like authorship of what I was doing on stage as an actor in this way. She was like, I have everything I've ever done before. The director has sort of said, I think this is what I want you to do. And then I would work really hard to execute that in a way that made sense to me. Like, she wasn't saying like, that's bad and I hated doing it. I think she was like, no, that you can find a lot of ownership as an actor, even just executing exactly what the director tells you to do or exactly what the stage directions say. But she just said, I didn't realize that I could kind of make a suggestion in the room and have the response be, why don't we try that? Why don't we do it that way? Why don't we do it the way you have an impulse towards? And that's going to help me, the director and the playwright, learn about what this play is. And she just had never kind of worked in that process. And I was like, great, that's all I want, it's just for people to know that there's a way to have that kind of authorship and that kind of ownership of what you're doing on stage. And that going back into a process that's maybe more traditional, like maybe the next show she's doing is Into the Woods, she can still bring some of that with her and some of that spirit. And I think that makes a stronger performer. I think that makes a stronger ensemble to have someone who's like asking really good questions and who's kind of always digging for, why am I doing this? Do I understand what's happening? And how does it fit into the bigger picture? How is it telling the story?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Pablo. Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate it. Welcome to TRU. I hope you'll come back. I want to remind everybody that we do this for free or pay what you can, but it sure helps when you give donations. Sure does help. Last year when we started doing this, I didn't know how I was going to afford to do it, but people were extremely generous, and we used to make couple $100 in donations in every one of these community gatherings. Now we're doing about 20. So if anybody has it in their heart to do so, please go to trueonline.org. Well, actually, we have a new URL. True Donate, TRUDonate.com, TRUDonate.com, and consider giving a donation. And same thing to you, YouTube viewers. If you like what you see and you want to be part of us, first of all, definitely consider coming on Fridays at 5 o'clock. Just send me an email at trunltd@aol.com and put Zoom in the headline and make me smile. Use it in a fun way, and I'll put you on the list and we'll invite you every week. We're going to be off next week for Thanksgiving. I didn't do that last year. I actually did Thanksgiving, but this year no. And we'll be back on December 3rd with producer Cody Lassen and some associates who just have been the producers of the commercial jingle for Regina Comet off-Broadway, and they're going to talk about the off-Broadway experience and how we all long for the off-Broadway we used to know and whether we can get it back again.